That's not good.
Why isn't it good? It's
We're
fine.
live.
We're live now.
It says we're live.
That's a good way of starting. That's not good. Okay, so we've had more technical difficulties. Last week it was Glenn climbing on top of chairs to plug in his laptop.
That's not a technical issue.
There was no power.
power.
There was a lack of power was the technical issue.
Yeah, so this week we have a extravaganza of people in the conversation. We have Greg Shackles joining us, and we have Henrik Nielsen joining us. So we have some questions here, but I think a lot of questions are going to go around.
We can unmute for a second just to show our faces. So I'll unmute first. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
We have to unmute.
Well, yes, because Google Hangout won't show your face unless...
You cannot just talk.
No, because the microphone's plugged into me.
I see.
So everybody's going to see my
It's not really made for us all to be in the
silhouetted
same room,
face.
so that's the challenge. I think right now my face has the...
Because it may...
Because I unmuted. You can unmute and say hi.
Yes,
Just
Yes,
unmute.
he already is.
All right, good.
Hang on. So, okay, that's my 15 seconds of fame.
So you can see we're really good at HTTP and not so good at audio visual. So fortunately, our conversation will be focused around HTTP. Little quick introductions around the room. Maybe Henrik, you want to start off and thanks.
How about introduce the 4th episode?
The 4th episode, yes. We're quite surprised that this has gone on and keeps going on, and we keep getting questions, although they're coming in a variety of different channels at the moment. But keep your questions coming, and we will keep recording the podcast.
Sounds good.
So Henrik has a fairly close relationship with HTTP. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved.
Oh, yeah, well, that's probably before many of you were even born. It started out very early on. In fact, I was I was a student, and when I started out was a student in Denmark, where I'm from, and I found out that it was great to go out and try, and as a student, to get projects in different places, and so I was recommended to go to CERN in Switzerland because they do a lot of stuff, mostly about smashing particles, of which I know nothing. But they said, well, there's this Tim guy working something called the web, and he seems very passionate about it. We don't know what it is, but why don't you go and talk to him? And so I walked over, literally the CERN campus in Switzerland, and they said, hi, can I help? And he said, very sort of Tim-like, yes, sit down and start doing some work. And so that's how I started out. Essentially, got introduced to the web very early on. And then the very first thing that happened was that I met Roy Fielding and a bunch of other people who were passionate about the web at that time, building browsers, and Reason was just starting around Netscape, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I remember the very first web conference was in the spring of '94, and there were about 300 people, and that was pretty much everybody who knew anything about the web in the entire world. And obviously, from then on, it was already exploding, and then it just went off from there. So essentially, it was a very unusual introduction to working with web technology and HTTP and other things, but it was very exciting.
Thank you for that intro, Henrik. And we think you've done a pretty good job with HTTP, we have to say.
Well,
let's give a round of applause for HTTP.
It's really, just a minion amongst many who have been participating and done great work on that one. So it's really a community effort. Obviously, primarily driven in the beginning from Tim's vision about what the web should be, and it has rolled on from there with lots of new good things coming out all the time. It's really amazing how it works out.
And more recently, how Glenn and I got involved with dealing with you is through Microsoft's Web API project.
Yeah, yes, that was great fun to do.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride getting to know how the advisory board that Glenn set up on that was great, talking to a lot of different people and interacting people from different communities. all giving feedback into the Web API stack. It was a great experience.
Yes, and it's very webbish in that regard, in the sense that it is community driven. It's about us figuring out together, because there are n number of ways that you can do these things, and really there's not one right way of doing it, and so you have to make a lot of compromises. You have to make sure that what you do is something that people find useful, and you can't do that unless you work intimately with people and have a community around it, and then they say, oh no, it should be this way, that way, and if you don't have that, there's just no way that you can get it interesting.
Right.
Yes, it was definitely a fun part of that project. Was actually before I ever joined. I remember to this day when I was interviewing for the position, and my boss at the time, Kirill, was like, "Hey, would you like to meet Henrik?" We had that first initial discussion, which was early days, right? And we talked about all the bad things about soap and.
Yes.
Check that one off.
But yeah, it's been fun stuff.
So, Greg, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So that's a really tough intro to follow. So yeah, my intro is going to be far less exciting. My name is Greg Shackles. I'm a principal engineer over at a company named Olo right now. I do a lot of the other side of HTTP, so I come at it more from the user perspective. I write a lot of web apps and APIs and mobile apps and things like that. So I'll try to provide HTTP for the common man kind of perspective here.
That's really cool.
Awesome.
So, do we want to just start with the questions that we have in the queue, or Greg has some questions?
Yeah, let's start with some of the questions that are in the queue, but I think one of the things we wanted to do different, I mean, this is the first time we've had guests on the show, and Greg, I think, may also have a question or two. So let's start off with what we have in the queue, and then we'll give some time to Greg also to ask his questions.
Okay, excellent. So the first couple of questions come from a friend of ours, Pedro, who actually also was on the Web API Advisory Board. And he asked the question, should we use 400 or 404 when you have an invalid parameter in a query string? Does anybody want to voice an opinion on that?
Oh man, this is like one of those stump the chumps kind of questions, because there really is there's no sort of exactly right answer.
But that's the problem, is people
They
don't know what is the right thing to do, and you're right, there is no specific answer,
right.
but there has to be some kind of guidance.
What I found, so if you look at it from what does a web browser, imagine that you're not a machine, but you're in fact a human being, and you use HTML and you browse around. When you pass in query parameters, if you don't pass in the right set of parameters or whatever else, then you typically get some indication back in the user UI that something went wrong. It's not just you failed. It is, well, here's some stuff that you should probably improve, and then if you improve that, you can submit stuff back again. So whether you using a 400 or 404. So 400 is sort of the catch-all for anything, basically. It's your fault.
Request, yeah.
It's your fault, as opposed to it's my fault, because it's sort of the 500 set of things. But in there, really, I think the primary thing is to also give some indication in the response of what it actually is. Some validation error, something else saying, well, I need to have the following set of parameters. If you just respond a 404 or even a 400 and nothing else, you're not helping, in the sense that the whole point sort of is that you want to make the communication succeed at some point. And if you just say, well, you messed up, that's not going to help. And so you have to think of it little sort of, well, what can I do also to provide error messages? And for example, and that's one of the things we did in Web API, we sort of had a mechanism for you to include a little bit of information as an error description for what actually it is that might be useful. And there we could send validation data, we could send other kind of stuff. And then that would be probably more useful. So you might notice that I didn't actually answer that question.
But you're saying the payload is a very important part of reporting errors.
Is it possible to return a payload in a 404?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. So in that case, would you say 404 but give an explanation, or would you use some other 400 code.
So
And like a example, a related example to this, I think, is sometimes when there's no data. It's not exactly an invalid query string, but I maybe query for, like let's say I was
A
doing
search request, and
querying
there's
a
no
search
results.
request, no
Yep.
results.
yes,
It's
and the
a
same thing.
related one.
It depends a little because the invalid query string, it can either be, well, you didn't send me, say, your shoe size as a query parameter, and I need that, or you send a shoe size of -5, which is not a valid, and so it very quickly gets into data validation, other kind of things, where it's not so much it's not found, it's just that really
It's not
the data
available
is not
currently.
available,
And it might change in a minute.
it might change in a minute. So 404 is often used in context where saying, well, if you send me 404, that means I take it out because the thing is not there.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily what you want to convey here.
One
So
very
semantics is a big thing here.
Yeah.
What is the semantics of the user and what's happening?
Yeah.
That should determine that.
One very simplistic approach that I've said to a few people you can take is you can say, well, if it's a 404, it means there's something wrong with the URL.
Mhm.
If it's a 422, right, the new one that came out of WebDAV, the unprocessable entity, then there's something wrong with your body. If it's a 400, then, well, I don't know where the role of it is. It could be in the URL, it could be in
Well,
the
but
headers.
404 could also be the network is down.
Well,
Technically,
it
can it?
shouldn't be. It
If a
shouldn't.
server, well, but if the server is not reachable, you can get, like if I just go put an arbitrary URL
But
in.
then it's not the client's fault, right? It's got to be.
No, it's not the client's fault. I'm just saying that there is a clear case of
But it could-
404, which
yeah,
is
yes.
where this really doesn't exist.
So before we beat that particular problem to death, I want to just mention one other thing. Are you familiar with the draft standard HTTP problem from Bart Nottingham, which is a standardized response body for errors coming from HTTP?
I haven't read it. I think I've seen it just passing by.
So from an opinion, like, do you think that's a valuable goal for us to have a completely standardized format for reporting error bodies
Well,
for APIs as opposed to necessarily the human web?
yes, I think it is useful to have a way for describing information that is machine consumable. And there's a variety of different formats that you can either use existing formats or you can come up with something else. Obviously, it shouldn't be exclusive in the sense that you can only send this now in a 400 or 404. HTTP has always shied away from dictating much about the format. The closest really is around if you can send I believe, a 300 status code where it says there are some multiple choices. And I forget whether we in fact indicated something. The other one where we said something was multiple ranges in a range request where you can send back a MIME multipart. And we actually registered a MIME multipart format. But other than that, HTTP really
Is agnostic.
it does not want to get into your body, so to speak, and that's where you have. So it's perfectly fine as a convention to use on top of HTTP to say I'm going to use that particular format, and that I think could be very useful in many places because otherwise you end up in a situation where, as you're not a human being, you can sort of interpret what is going on. You really need to have some kind of information.
Yeah. I know Akamai are using it, obviously, because Mark works now for Akamai. And I was just told Glimpse are now using HTTP problem as a response format. So I think that's...
At a meta level, one of the things I think that's interesting is as we've had these shows, some of these questions, the answers are not short. And so we don't actually need that long of a
Not many
queue of questions. Just thought I'd drop that tidbit in.
Okie dokie, right.
So as usual, though, if we go back and meta up, it depends.
Yes.
It's kind of like the standard answer. So any question you ask us, well, most questions that you ask us, there's a decent chance that it depends is one valid answer. There are some places where maybe we could say, if it's clearly in the spec, we do not say, it is not, it depends.
Mm-hmm.
So we got a question from somebody that I didn't plug in the question here. So let's take this one from Matthew Arabs. He says, what are the forgotten HTTP codes that are really helpful in a real-life application? Because we kind of have this tendency of sticking with the standard response codes. Are there any that
409.
are not used as much and they should be?
I think 409 for caching kind of scenarios,
For
like ETAG.
conflict?
Yeah, conflict resolution. I mean, I think a lot of people don't really even understand the fact that there is a provision. We talked a bit about it in our last show about the provisions that exist in HTTP for concurrency and caching. But particularly, I think a lot of people get that HTTP is about caching, but don't necessarily grok that there actually is a concurrency mechanism that is part of the design. And so 409 is a status code for precondition failed, I believe. And so if you have a cached result and if you have an ETAG, you can go and you can use headers like if match or if none match, where you basically are setting a condition and you're saying, like, I want to do either a conditional get, which is not really so much about concurrency, it's more about, is the cache thing that I have still valid? But you can also do conditional put. And what was the other one you had said we talked about in the previous episode? You talked about another form of ETAG.
Well, it was input.
It was put.
Was the scenario, and it was the case of whether you send an ETAG back or not.
Yeah.
Tells you
a
not
new
whether
yes.
if the server makes the change to the resource after you've done the put, if you don't get an ETAG back, you know that, or the ETAG can tell you whether or not the server updated the thing on the server.
Because it's a different ETAG.
It should actually on a put request send back assuming that it's a 200 you get back, you should send back a new ETAG so that the browser, assuming that it's some kind of an editor or whatever else, can continue and now know that next time I'm going to submit something, that's what I'm going to base it on, and then move on from there. Because otherwise the client would have to come back and say, well, what ETAG do we have now? And then that's the idea for having ETAGs being sent back in for 12 responses.
Yeah. So 409 would be my vote for not as used.
I was of course thinking of the 418. I'm a teapot, but
is that useful though? There's the use. There's helpful.
Well,
how exactly is that helpful? If you are a teapot, that is helpful.
The one you mentioned there, the 300, I think, is something that's really not used very much.
No, it's not used at all. Yeah. And there's redirections have always been kind of challenging because you didn't know was supposed to use the sort of permanent or the temporary redirect, and when you redirect, does the method follow along, or does it flip over from a post to a get, or those all these kind of questions that have always been sort of haunting. And I think some of the later, like 307 and now 308, which is also coming along, clarifies some of that. But the earlier redirects were used in all kind of ways, and the interesting thing is it's just once they start being used in a particular way, you can't change the description of saying, oh, by the way, you try to use 301 in the photo array, now it means something different. Once it's out of the pond, it's out.
They can expand on the definition like they've done with 201, with like the definition, the semantics behind post, for example.
Yeah.
But that didn't change what was existing; it just expanded the definition.
Yes, and that actually brings up just one other point in that the way HTTP was developed was very much, or has been developed ever since, has evolved, is very much as a community effort where it's about reflecting what is actually happening in the world. And so even though it is now, it was developed inside IETF, IETF is not in a position to say, well, this is how things shall be. It always has to work with community and figure out, well, there's some amount of what is called sort of history writing, yet you have to say, this is how the world looks. Now, you might disagree with it, but this is what we're going to have in order to get optimal interoperability between applications. And so these status codes go way back in the history of IETF. They've been used in many protocols, FTP, SMTP. They all have status codes. And there have always been challenges of figuring out which ones are the right ones to use and what is the registration for new ones. And so it's very easy to, when you sit out and think about which one should I use, you just use one of the ones that are there, even though it might be slightly different semantics, and then you're in this situation that sort of the goalposts change a little for what does it mean to involve a particular status code. But that's in terms of, so the 300 was really very early on. Content negotiation has always been very high on the list, especially from Tim all the way in the beginning, that you had a way for coming up with content negotiation. And there's been enormous amount of effort going into figuring out what content negotiation actually is. Yeah. And it's complicated. Because do you see an HTML in Danish being worth more than a PDF in Spanish? Well, it depends, right? And so it's very difficult to figure out what those things are. But the 300 status code was more to come up with saying, well, I actually have this resource in a variety of different versions, formats.
Yeah.
And which one would you like to have? But I think it's one of those things that it just didn't really jive with the many, even to this day, web servers primarily serve
server-driven, agent-driven.
Agent-driven, and they're primarily a file server for content.
So just to clarify for people that don't know on the call, we talked a bit about ConEgg, or content. ConEgg is the short name, content negotiation, in the previous episode. Is that there really are these two types of content negotiation. There's the one that a lot of web frameworks use nowadays, which is agent-driven or server-driven, which basically means that the server is looking at a bunch of headers when a request comes in. It's looking at things like the accept header, and it can look at other things, like there are variations of accept, like an accept on locale, like an accept on language. And then the server has an algorithm, some type of heuristic. It makes a decision based on what's available as to what it can return. And as we mentioned, there's pros and cons to this approach. It's really hard to get that algorithm right, and it doesn't really put the full control in the client side. So a client-driven approach is really what Henrik was talking about, is where the server can actually return you a list and say, here's all the different things I have. You choose. The beauty of that, the server completely punts the algorithm as far as doing the selection. It just says, here's what's available, and you make a decision. One question I have for you is, in that model, is there any filtering? Is the client able to say, well, like let's say there were hundreds of different representations that are available. Does the client have a way to say, show me everything that fits within this subset, I'll still make the choice, or does it just give everything? It's just a question.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that. I mean, you can always create additional resources that only have subsets of representations, right? But there's nothing that I've seen.
No baked-in semantics with a header or anything. Yeah.
No, sorry. One of the things that I think is very interesting there is you start to look at formats like sort of metadata descriptions like Hypermedia or whatever else, where you can get a variety of different formats that you can actually send back saying, well, here's how you might be able to move forward from where you are, not just in terms of the sort of the state machines, but also in terms of representations that are available and views that are available and be able
related data.
Well, the irony is we use it all the time. You've got an HTML page, and there's a rel alternate to an RSS feed, right? I mean, so that is used quite extensively on the web. It's just you're delivering a default format, which is Hypermedia enabled, that points to an alternate format. Right? And that's just the difference with 300 is you're making a request, you're doing a round trip, and you haven't actually got anything back yet.
Yeah.
So you're forced to make two round trips.
Yes.
By embedding the link rel equals alternate, you get a default, and you can get the secondary one if you want it.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of approaches.
Greg, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Nothing that I could really add to what was just said.
So there was a question down at the bottom that kind of rolls into this. Is Eric says, I used 204 for delete, and I recently integrated with a partner, and they're using 204 instead of 404 to represent not found. What are your thoughts on this, and what other times have you used 204?
I have zero to weigh in on this one.
Okay.
I have no experience with 204.
Well, 204 is no content, right?
Oh, that's
so
I guess I do have experience. I just
so
thought of it as no content.
Just no content. So here's the way that you can justify.
This is the delete. This is the delete question of like, was there a resource there at some point or not?
But this is not. He's just saying that when he deletes, that he's getting a 200, but he's not returning any payload to say anything about the thing that he did delete, right?
Sure.
Which is perfectly valid. Now, somebody deciding to use 204 instead of 404, what they're effectively saying is, we're saying we've built an API where we support every single resource in this entire URI space. Even if you mash on the keyboards, we support that resource, but we're just going to return you there's no content here. So it from a debugging point of view, it does make it a little bit difficult if you happen to make a typo in the URL, because you've no real clear indication between, well, did I make a mistake on that URL, or did I just, because you're just going to get a 204. So although I don't think you could say it's completely wrong, I don't think it's the wisest option to use. I think 404 is more specific.
Well, so
Saying,
a related topic to this one as well, I'm going to bring in related topics, is if I deleted something and I tried to delete it again, should that be the same result or a different result? Should the server be responsible to remember that this resource existed at some point? I'm just throwing this out there, right, because it's certainly
that's
a topic that
404 versus 410, right?
Yes.
So 410 is gone because it was
yes.
here once upon a time.
Yes.
404. Again, I think the one nice thing about the status codes is they start out as being very, very generic, and then there are specialized cases where you can add more information. Right? Where gone is, it's not here anymore, but it was once upon a time. 404 is, I don't know, it's not here now.
But how important is it for a server to implement those semantics? How important is it for a server to remember that this resource existed? How important is it for a client to know, actually, that, by the way, this resource existed before?
Yeah, we weren't able to come up with anything when we talked about this a few.
We talked about
any
gone.
reasons why gone might be actually useful?
I actually have an interesting.
Oh, yes.
There's a scenario. There's a scenario now where gone is interesting, but I think the general thing about your APIs is also how much do you want to remember, because there might be. It really depends on what your API represents.
Yeah.
Because you might want to say, well, if I delete something, you can delete it sort of safely again, and it's fine to represent a 200 because the client needs not need to make any distinction. Sort of, there's nothing different.
Right.
There are other cases where if the client needs to do something different, you want to say, well, this in fact is no longer there, and you can either do that as a 404 or as a 410. But it depends on what you expect the client to be able to do. So a way to think about the status codes is a way to say, well, what would you like the client to do? Would you like the client just to sort of go on its merry way, or do you want to do something specific or know about it? And generally speaking, the more specific you are, is probably the better path.
I just thought of a use case. Yes.
Tell us.
If you were exposing a file system over an API, there's the concept of undelete of files. So you could technically imagine having an ability to say that if a resource represented something that was like a file and that file got deleted, then if I sent you a 410, it may have been a way of saying to you that, hey, now I haven't told you how to do that. That's a different question.
Yeah.
But that there might be a way that you can actually undelete that resource.
Yeah.
We didn't think about that one.
No.
But that's just an example of, it depends on the semantics of
sure.
your API.
Yeah.
And I think the status codes are there to kind of help you.
Right.
It's not so much whether do I pick the right one. It's merely sort of, this is how you can help. They can help you to provide the information that you want to the client.
So think about the kind of problem that you're trying to solve, and the status codes are there to help you. It's not, like you must do this status code or die kind of situation.
Right. Absolutely. So cool. I think we've done enough of the questions, because Daniel's going to give us a hard time because we are time boxed in this, because otherwise we can talk forever.
We did start late.
Yes, I know. So Greg.
Yes. Actually, the last kind of question and conversation there kind of leads well into what I was going to bring up, I think.
Unmute so we can see this.
And this kind of comes out of a conversation of.
There you go. You're live, right?
All right. So this kind of comes out of a conversation Glenn and I were having last night. I know we've kind of spoken about this before, and coming at it from the other end of the pipe, right? So you have your server, and it's all well and good to say, well, you have all these status codes, and you have things like hypermedia, and you can kind of send all of this rich amount of information and nuance and stuff down to the client, but then it's really up to the client to start using that. And kind of the abstraction that you usually see when you're architecting applications, and I'm using apps as kind of a greater sense, so it could be web apps, or mobile apps, whatever. Typically, like coming from the .NET world, you would imagine some sort of interface where you have task of T, where T is some sort of model object, right? And by doing that, you basically right from the bat throw out all of that nuance. You're abstracting away all of the HTTP stuff. You're giving a nice clean abstraction for the rest of your application layer, so that's why it's usually done. You always do the same thing with databases, and it's hidden behind an interface. But you don't get any of that nuance. So the thing that I always kind of battle with is when architecting things that I'm doing, and that I don't really have an answer to, which is why I'm always curious to hear perspective of you guys on this. It's just like where do you start drawing the line of how far first-class knowledge of HTTP should bleed into an application? Because I mean, really, if you want to take full advantage of all this stuff, then your app really knows that it's HTTP that's being done.
Mm-hmm. Sal, you want to unmute? Again? Let's mute you. Show his face.
Okay.
Go back to the broadcaster.
Henrik, go ahead.
I'd like to see
my
what Henrik
opinion
has to
on
say.
this a lot.
No, so I think in general, when you expose APIs as HTTP, you have an opportunity to make them so that they are easy to consume by other parties. And now, if that's not your goal, if your goal is to write a SPA app that only talks to that particular API, you can pretty much do whatever you want, because that's
an implementation detail.
Yes, it's sort of your interaction pattern from you write the client side and it talks specifically to your API. But if you want that API to be used by other parties, then you sort of have two basic choices. You can either try and explain the benefits of your particular semantics and your particular protocol to the rest of the world, or you can say, well, here are the things in terms of HTTP that we use. And it's my experience that the latter is typically easier, because you sort of start, you don't have to explain the basic pieces. You can start off with, well, here's how you express, here's how we expose the data, here's what the data looks like, here's how you can interact with the data. You can sort of focus more on what your data what it looks like, what it means. Is it a teapot? Is it a airplane? Is it a pizza ordering site? Whatever else, and focus on that aspect then to how to talk.
Someone needs to hook an Arduino up to a teapot and have it return.
I'm pretty sure it's been done.
Yes. And so it is really more a way for you to get easier consumption of your API. And my guess is that in many scenarios that's the goal. And if that's the goal, then sticking to some of the things that are generally understood as being shared sort of understanding of what HTTP can is probably going to be beneficial.
So to that part, I completely agree with that. I think, and I probably just explained it, at least kind of the conversation that I wanted to have wrong. But I'm thinking of it more from the other angle of when you're actually writing the client.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a developer. I'm building some sort of application that's talking to an API that has takes full advantage of HTTP in this hypothetical situation, right?
So hypermedia. So for example, there's
hypermedia, all the status codes, all the caching, like all the rich data coming back over HTTP. Like that's all available in this API.
Yeah.
Like how far? Like is it like maybe should we just accept that those clients are going to just have first-class knowledge of all?
Like, do you surface something like HTTP response message FT, for example, throughout the app?
Right, basically.
Do they have to know about headers?
That's
do they have to know
the part
about
that I
all
have a
these
hard
things?
time figuring out where to draw the line, personally.
Yes, I
It
think
would just be me.
well, I think that's a good question. I think the thing that might make it slightly easier to think about is that HTTP, as Glenn mentioned earlier, is really about a sort of negotiation between a client and a server. It's like a conversation. The client comes up and says, hey, I would like to do something along those lines, and the server says, whoa, I can do this and this, I can't do that, and then they sort of figure things out. It's not a binary communication where you send me something, if there's like one bit flipped the wrong way, then
the world's over.
The world is over. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And as part of that, you can write clients that are vastly different in terms of capabilities.
Yeah.
If you really happen to be a teapot or you want to go talk to something else, you might have a very small subset of what you want to do in terms of maybe you can't do range requests or e-tags or something, a whole bunch of things that sort of more sophisticated clients can do. But the goal of HTTP has always been that you can have a range of clients, so you don't have to go and implement. It take you a month to come up with a just basic thing in order to talk to an API. It should be able to get going fairly quickly, and then you can sort of add functionality as an opt-in as you need it on the client side. And if you think of it that way, it's not that you necessarily, if you go all out and make part of your API sort of fully HTTP all the way with caching semantics and whatever else, then you prohibit those kind of applications. You really don't. You just have to make sure that you sort of have this ramp that clients can do. And if you have the ramp in mind, saying, well, if you're really basic client, what are the things that you have, the basic things that you can do out of your API? And if you have that model, it probably works out okay.
Yeah, this is a question that really comes close to my heart, because I've thought a lot about this, and I don't think there's one magic answer. I think it's a very good question, and I think as you see, and even if you look at some of these movements, going back to some of the stuff we've talked about, of things like Swagger and auto-generated clients, it's about, hey, like, how do we make life easy? And I don't think so. A couple of fundamental things. Like, I don't think it's a requirement that everybody who is going to interact with an HTTP system at every level understands all the finer points of HTTP. I think that's a fail. I also don't think that we should be taking our programmatic concepts and imposing that all the way down the line. Like, we talked about RPC and how lots of APIs in the past were RPC driven, that we're really looking at, that HTTP was built for a thing, and people were trying to use it in a way that it wasn't really designed for, and that caused lots of, conceptual leaks and other kinds of things. So there's a middle way in between that.
Right.
I also, I think one of the things people get caught up on, like when they talk about hypermedia, and Dal and I have done a bunch of experimentation, him more than me, on thinking about hypermedia clients, is this idea that if you've got a client that's deployed on an application, that client has to somehow magically evolve. And I've since, early on, I think when I first started getting into hypermedia, I started thinking, this is a while now, I started thinking, oh yeah, wow, hypermedia gives this promise. But yeah, it gives that potential, but it also creates a lot of challenges. So I think this idea of different versions of clients being able to live side by side with one another that have different capabilities, that's a much more realizable goal that allows you to start to leverage hypermedia without necessarily the person who is using that client knowing all the details about HTTP, or even knowing that hypermedia is coming into play. And I've just done a bunch of experimentation on this. I haven't deployed anything in production using that kind of model, but from what I've seen, it looks promising that is an approach that is possible. So that means that somebody can have an experience that feels more natural to them, and yet behind the scenes, actually, it is dealing with the API the way the API is designed to be worked with. So it's all about finding that right level of abstraction, I think, and where's the right place to put that.
Exactly.
But I think it's a great question, and I think it's not one that I have any magic answers to, just because I think it's still very young in terms of people building these kinds of clients.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's about the level of abstraction. And what we're trying to do is, on the client side, raise the level of abstraction a little bit higher than just plain generic HTTP messages without losing lots of flexibility. And one little architectural style I want to pick on, because I think it is a significant thing, is we have this habit of creating methods on the client that correlate to a particular URI template on the server. So, get customer, we'll call, HTTP example.org/customer, curly brackets, ID, because we parameterize that URI space, right? The part that we miss by doing that mapping of procedure on the client to link template or URI template on the server is that you end up, there are many cases where there are different URI templates that have exactly the same interaction semantics. And this notion of, this is a link, this type of link, and this type of link has this type of behavior. By adding that extra level of abstraction, I've found personally, from my own experience, you can build classes on the client that
Reusable.
that are reusable across multiple different resource templates,
Nice.
which then allows you to evolve your API, add new resources. The classic example is, these are the issues that are open, in our GitHub repo, and these are the issues that are closed. And we have those two endpoints, and we have our methods, and 3 weeks later we decide, we should have like high priority ones. So we add a new issue/high priority. Well, do we have to really go and create a new method on the client to deal with that? Because really all it is a list of issues.
Semantics.
It's just
a different URI.
Yeah, so we don't really have very much on the client side that helps us model that notion of the type of link. And that's something I've been working a lot.
And I mean, another interesting thing you mentioned there, which the API area guys were pushing on, is this idea of clients that download metadata at the beginning. Like if you have multiple, if you've got something like you said, where you could have, multiple different resources that behave almost identically, they just have kind of a different name. These are things that potentially could be discovered at runtime, and you could have a more general purpose way of interacting with
Yeah,
it.
you can. Sooner or later, you've got to bring domain semantics in there. You can't avoid
Oh
it.
no, I don't mean that. But if you have a domain-specific type of thing, like you're mentioning, like issues, returning issues,
Right.
and you've got issues that could have different types of filters associated with them, for example.
Yes, you can discover those endpoints.
That's
right.
what I mean.
Okay.
That's exactly what I mean.
Discover those resources.
Yeah,
Use the word
that's what I mean.
endpoints. Pedro will be upset at me.
Any other questions? I think we're getting close. Daniel's going to pull the plug shortly.
No.
Well, it's been an excellent conversation. I'm really happy that we happen to be here all at the same time.
Yeah, it's
that we're
fantastic.
able to do this.
And nobody will know about all the technical stuff we went
Oh
through
no, we didn't
because-
tell anybody
Until
about
now.
that.
but they won't see it because we didn't press start until we were ready.
You'll just see a really dark Daryl over there.
Yes, yes.
This is true. We'll have to see if we can brighten you up. Maybe there's a way we can edit to do that.
Oh, Daniel's giving us more time, but that's okay. I think we've had a good conversation. Thank you for giving us your time, Henrik.
Thank you so much.
we're
Henrik,
gonna-
it was awesome to have you here. Thank you so
very
much
good. It
for
was
joining
very
us.
And
It's deep version.
while we're at the MVP Summit, the comment is, this is hosted on the brownbag.net,
It is.
which is a community-driven site.
Yes.
So if people have areas of expertise that they're really interested in sharing, it's an awesome platform. It's, as long as you don't try and get 4 people in a room and try and share the same microphone, it's a really easy platform to get working. And I mean, that's what MVP Summit is all about, right? It's about, people who've contributed to the community and getting people together and sharing. So I encourage people to do the same thing and get on
or
Brownbag.net.
contribute to the fact that the web even exists.
Yes.
Well, there is that.
Yes. Small thing. Greg, thank you also for joining us. This
My
was
pleasure.
a last minute. We pulled you in,
That's
bent
fine.
your arm, all that good stuff. But that was great. Great question. And okay, so we will plan to see you next week, which now I realize I'm visible, so somebody would have seen me do that little lip sync there.
That's right. We are back in home base next week, and we'll get a whole bunch more questions.
And we
from the
left,
community.
and we left 2. So as I said, we can easily fill up the time with
Indeed, we can.
interesting
We can talk.
discussions.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.